Officer Derek Walsh had his hand on my throat before I could even drop my backpack. The brick wall scraped against my cheek, cold, rough, smelling of old rain and exhaust, and I tasted blood where my lip split against the mortar. I heard a woman across the street make a sound, one sharp, involuntary sound, like something precious shattering on tile. I was 16 years old. I was carrying a calculus textbook, a dog-eared copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God, and a peanut butter sandwich my grandmother had packed that morning. And this man, badge gleaming in the October sun, forearm pressed against my windpipe, was screaming at me to stop resisting. I hadn't moved a single muscle, but none of that is what this story is about. What this story is about is what happened 43 minutes later, when the black SUV with city plates turned onto 5th Street and the door swung open. But let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand the kind of morning it was before it became that kind of afternoon. I grew up in Claremont, one of those neighborhoods that real estate listings politely called transitioning, which meant half the block had been renovated into coffee shops with exposed brick and Edison bulbs, and the other half still had bars on the windows and hand-painted signs in the bodega doors. My mother and I lived in a narrow brownstone on Archer Street that she'd bought 12 years earlier, when the neighborhood was mostly empty lots and stubborn ambition. She'd painted the front door red herself on a Sunday morning in October, the same month I always noticed, standing on the front stoop in paint-spattered jeans and a Howard University sweatshirt, humming something low and rhythmic under her breath while I handed her the brushes. I was 4 years old. I remember the smell of the paint, sharp and chemical and almost sweet, and the way she laughed when a fat red drip landed on my sneaker and she said, "Now you're part of the house too, baby." My mother's name is Dr. Claudette Okafor Williams. She worked long hours, left early, came home late, and always, without exception, made sure there was food in the refrigerator and a book on my nightstand. She didn't talk about her job much. When I was small, I assumed she worked for the city in some administrative capacity. Meetings, paperwork, phone calls that lasted too long, and left her quiet at dinner. I didn't understand the full weight of what she did until I was older. She never made a point of explaining it. She was that kind of woman, the kind who let her actions fill the room before her title ever did. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That Tuesday morning I woke to the sound of her voice from the kitchen, low and precise, the cadence she used when something needed to be handled before sunrise. I lay still for a moment, staring at the water stain on my ceiling that had always looked, to me, like the continent of Africa, and listened to her words without catching them. Something was wrong somewhere, or something needed fixing. With her, those were usually the same thing. I pulled on jeans and a gray hoodie and went downstairs. She was standing at the counter in her good coat, the dark navy one with the structured shoulders and the single silver button at the throat, holding a coffee mug in both hands and speaking quietly into her phone. She glanced at me when I came in, and something in her expression shifted, softened for exactly 1 second, the way a controlled fire will briefly gutter in a draft before it went back to steady. She pressed the phone against her chest. "Breakfast," she said, pointing at the counter. Then she pointed at the clock on the microwave. 7:45, and she was back on the call, pacing. I ate oatmeal standing up. Watching her cross the kitchen in those low-heeled shoes she saved for days with important rooms in them. The apartment smelled of her coffee and the cedar of her coat, and faintly the red paint on the front door, a smell that had embedded itself so deeply into the building that I sometimes thought the walls exhaled it. I couldn't name what I was feeling, standing there with a spoon in my hand. Charged, maybe, like the particular quality of air before a storm rolls in from the lake. I kissed her on the cheek before I left. She caught my arm, just for a second, just her fingers around my wrist, and squeezed. She didn't always do that. I noticed it and filed it somewhere, The way you file small things that don't seem to mean anything yet. I thought about it again, much later, when I was standing with my face against a brick wall. And then I understood that her body had known something her mind hadn't finished processing. The walk to Jefferson High was 14 blocks. I knew every seam in the sidewalk, every corner store owner, every face that belonged to the neighborhood, and everyone that didn't. Mr. Castillo's bodega opened at 6 with the radio already too loud. The Moreno twins from Prospect were always late and always jogging, their backpacks slapping against their spines. The woman on the corner of 5th fed the pigeons no matter what the city sign said, and the pigeons had long since learned her schedule better than she knew it herself. I noticed the patrol car the way you notice a splinter, not immediately, but with a slow, building awareness, a low irritation at the periphery of your attention. It was idling at the corner of 5th and Archer, white and blue, engine running, exhaust curling in the cold air. I didn't look directly at it. You learn, early and without being formally taught, not to look directly. You learn to keep your hands visible and your pace even and your expression carefully neutral, because any deviation from that invisible, unwritten script tends to be read as something it isn't. My mother had taught me these things with the same calm, matter-of-fact precision she applied to everything. You keep your hands where they can see them, Marcus. You speak clearly, and you don't argue, and you call me the second something feels wrong. I had been 12 the first time she said it, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface, and I remember thinking she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I kept walking. I shifted my backpack higher on my shoulder and fixed my eyes forward and thought about the derivative problems I hadn't finished the night before. The patrol car rolled forward. I heard the slow drag of tires on asphalt, deliberate and unhurried, keeping my pace. My stomach tightened. That particular specific tightening I'd felt before and hated and had never managed to reason away, no matter how many times I told myself it was just anxiety, just paranoia, just the weight of knowing something that I couldn't unknow. I was not being paranoid. "Hey!" The voice came through the open passenger window, flat and certain. "Hey you, stop right there." I stopped. I turned slowly, keeping my hands loose and visible at my sides. There were two of them, the one who stayed in the car and the one who got out. The one who got out was broad and thick through the shoulders, mid-40s, with a wide reddish face, and the unhurried, proprietorial look of a man who had already made up his mind before he opened the door. I would learn later that his name was Officer Derek Walsh, 12-year veteran, 3 commendations, 2 complaints filed and dismissed. He walked toward me with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and the morning light hitting his badge at an angle that made it difficult to look at directly. "What's in the bag?" he said. "School books," I said. My voice came out more level than I'd expected. "I'm on my way to Jefferson High." He stopped about 3 feet away and looked me over, slowly, with a deliberate, unhurried contempt. The kind of look that's designed to communicate that you are a problem he has already solved, a category rather than a person. Behind me, I could hear Mr. Castillo's radio playing something fast and bright and absurdly cheerful. "You live around here?" "Yes, sir." "Archer Street." "Uh-huh." He tilted his head slightly, and something in the gesture made the hair on the back of my neck rise. "Which school, you said?" "Jefferson, 14th and Morgan." He glanced back at his partner in the car, and something passed between them, a look I couldn't fully decode but understood instinctively, in the oldest, most animal part of my brain, before my conscious mind had finished processing it. My hands had gone cold. The pulse in my throat was very loud. "I'm going to need you to put the bag down," Walsh said, "and put your hands on the wall." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. I stood there for exactly 1 second, processing. There was no reason stated, no violation named. I was on a public sidewalk at 7:50 in the morning, a minor with a backpack full of school books, not running, not shouting, not doing anything except existing in a neighborhood where some people had apparently decided my existence required verification. "Is there a reason?" I said carefully. "I haven't." He moved fast, faster than his size suggested. One moment I was standing, and the next the brick was against my cheek, and something was pressed hard across the back of my neck, and his voice was in my ear, loud and rhythmic, saying, "Stop resisting, stop resisting." And I was not resisting. I was barely breathing. My backpack slid from my shoulder and hit the pavement, and the calculus textbook tumbled out and landed open on the concrete, pages fluttering in the October wind, and something about that, the stupid, serene mundanity of those open pages with their neat rows of numbers, made everything feel more surreal, not less. Like the world had two tracks playing simultaneously, and they no longer matched. "Stop resisting." He said it with spaces between the words, like he was reading from something. I was not resisting. I was not moving. I was standing with my face against a wall, trying to keep my breathing even, trying to stay inside my own body. A woman across the street had stopped walking. A delivery man with a hand truck had stopped. Two kids from my school, I could see them from the corner of my eye, Deshawn and a girl whose name I didn't know, had stopped on the opposite sidewalk and stood absolutely still, watching. Nobody moved. Nobody said anything. The silence had a texture to it, dense and airless and collectively ashamed. The silence of people who know they are witnessing something wrong and are afraid of what it will cost them to say so. And then Walsh lowered his voice to something just above a whisper, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my ear. And he said, "You people always make this difficult. Every single time." I closed my eyes. The brick pressed into my cheekbone. Something in my chest, not my heart, something older and quieter than that, went very still. I didn't cry. I want to be precise about that. I did not cry. What I felt was something colder and more durable than grief, the particular clarifying rage of a person who has been told, without ambiguity, exactly what they are in someone else's eyes. And underneath it, underneath all of it, one single thought, rising slow and inevitable as a tide. She is going to find out about this. I didn't know then what that meant. I didn't know, standing there with my face against the cold brick and my calculus textbook lying open on the sidewalk, and a police radio crackling somewhere behind me, that the call had already been made. I didn't know that someone across the street had their phone raised and pointed. I didn't know that 43 minutes of Walsh speaking quietly into his radio, of his partner leaning on the hood with crossed arms, of me standing on that sidewalk while people walked past and looked away, would be all it took for the black SUV with city plates to round the corner of 5th Street. I just didn't know yet that Officer Derek Walsh was about to learn something about the woman who had painted our front door red all those years ago on an October morning, and who had squeezed my wrist before I left the house that day, like she was trying to give me some of whatever it was she carried inside her. He was about to learn her title, and I was going to watch his face when he did. The SUV pulled to the curb slowly, with the particular unhurried authority of a vehicle that has never once had to rush to make a point. The door opened before it fully stopped. She stepped out in the navy coat with the silver button, and for a moment she just stood there on the sidewalk with her hands at her sides and her eyes moving, from me to the wall to Walsh, to his partner still leaning on the hood, and then back to Walsh. The whole survey took perhaps 3 seconds. It was the quietest 3 seconds I had ever witnessed. Walsh turned at the sound of the door. His expression was the expression of a man who expects either a bystander or a problem, and who has ready-made responses for both. He opened his mouth. She crossed the distance between them in 8 measured steps, unhurried, and the look on her face stopped whatever he was going to say somewhere between his lungs and his lips. She stopped 2 feet from him. She did not look at me again. Her attention was entirely, surgically on him. "Take your hands off my son," she said. Her voice was quiet. Not soft. Quiet. There is a difference that I understand now, though I couldn't have articulated it then. Soft yields. Quiet does not. Walsh's jaw tightened. He shifted his weight, an involuntary, almost imperceptible step back that his training immediately tried to correct. "Ma'am, this is an active stop. If you'll step back—" "I am not going to step back," she said, and still her voice did not change register. "You are going to remove your hand from my son's neck. You are going to step away from this wall, and you are going to tell me on what grounds you detained a 16-year-old walking to school on a public sidewalk." Walsh looked at her. She looked at him. The radio crackled. Someone on the other side of the street had their phone up. I could see the small rectangular glint of the screen from where I stood, still pressed against the brick, still not moving. "And," she added, with a precision that made the word feel like the click of a weapon being cocked, "you're going to want to be very careful about what you say next." Walsh pulled his hand from the back of my neck. I didn't stumble. I made sure I didn't stumble. But I had to press my palm against the brick for exactly 1 second to find my balance. I turned around slowly. My cheek throbbed where the mortar had bitten into the skin. I looked at my mother. She was still watching Walsh. He had a look on his face I'd never seen on a man in uniform before. Not quite fear. Something adjacent to it. Something that happens when a structure a person has been relying on reveals itself suddenly to be less solid than they believed. His partner had straightened from the hood of the car and was looking between the two of them with the careful expression of a man who is privately beginning to calculate his own exposure. "I'm going to need your name and badge number," my mother said. "And your supervisor's direct line." "Now listen," Walsh started, and there was still a residue of authority in his voice, the habit of it, the muscle memory of a decade of people stepping back when he stepped forward. The minor was, "Marcus," she said, without taking her eyes off Walsh. "Pick up your things." I crouched down and gathered the calculus book from the sidewalk, tucked it back into my backpack, and stood up. My hands were steady. I was 17 days from 17 years old, and something had shifted inside me on a cellular level, something that I would carry for the rest of my life, both as a wound and as a kind of knowledge. I zipped the backpack. I stood behind her. "Badge number," she repeated. Walsh gave it. He gave it in a tone that had been stripped of everything except its facts, and I watched his partner give his too, unprompted, and I watched the thing that lives between men in uniform when the situation has tilted irrevocably, the thing that looks like solidarity, and is actually, in moments like this, its precise opposite. She took out her phone. She made a call. She didn't explain to Walsh who she was calling. She simply turned slightly away from him, not dismissively, but with the assurance of a person who no longer requires his participation in what happens next. I heard the call connect. I heard her say, "This is Deputy Commissioner Okafor Williams. I need to speak with the 14th Precinct Commander directly." "Yes, I'll hold." And she held, standing on a sidewalk in Claremont in her good coat, with her coffee-colored heels planted on the cracked concrete. She held. I watched Walsh's face while she held. The ruddy color had drained from it in slow stages, like water emptying from a tub, until what was left was a particular pale grayness that I recognized from my mother's stories about her work as the physiognomy of a man recalculating everything. Deputy Commissioner. He said nothing. His partner said nothing. The woman across the street had not lowered her phone. 2 more people had stopped. My mother finished the call in 4 minutes. When she turned back, she looked at Walsh with an expression I can only describe as the opposite of fury. Controlled, diagnostic, almost clinical. The expression of a person who has seen this before and knows exactly what it is and exactly what it costs. Internal Affairs will be in contact with your precinct by end of day, she said. I would strongly suggest you document the grounds for this stop in your report with significant care. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be deliberate. Is there anything else? Walsh shook his head. He couldn't quite make himself say no aloud. She put her hand on my shoulder. For the first time since she'd stepped out of the SUV, she looked at me. Really looked at me. At the scrape on my cheek and the dirt on my backpack and whatever was in my eyes that I couldn't control. And I watched something move across her face, something ancient and exhausted and furious and loving all at once, that she tucked away with a single quiet breath before it could become a scene. You're going to be late, she said softly. I know. I'll call the school. She squeezed my shoulder. Then she turned back and looked at Walsh one last time, and the look was not triumphant. That's the part people don't understand when I tell this story. It was not victorious. It was tired. It was the look of a woman who has been fighting this particular battle in this particular city for 22 years, who has won this iteration of it and knows with absolute certainty that she will be standing on another sidewalk, in some form, before the week is out. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked back to the SUV, got in, and pulled away from the curb. I stood on the sidewalk and watched the brake lights disappear around the corner. Walsh and his partner got back into the patrol car without a word. I heard the engine, the quiet roll of tires pulling away. The delivery man with the hand truck started walking again. Mr. Castillo's radio played something cheerful and indifferent. The woman who had been filming lowered her phone and caught my eye, and she nodded. Once, small, serious, and I nodded back, and then she walked on too. I picked up my backpack and started the 14 blocks to school. I was late to first period by 22 minutes. Mrs. Garland, who taught AP Calculus and had the patience of a person who has graded the same mistake 10,000 times without losing faith in mathematics itself, looked at me when I came in and took in the scrape on my cheek, the set of my jaw, whatever the morning had left on me. And she said nothing except, "Take your seat, Marcus. We're on chain rule problems." And I sat down, and I took out the textbook that had been on the Claremont sidewalk 40 minutes earlier, and I opened it to the page still creased from where it had fallen, and I stared at the numbers until they resolved back into meaning. The video had 40,000 views by the time I got out of school. By the next morning, it had 4.3 million. I didn't watch it. My mother called that evening and told me not to watch it, in the same calm voice she used for everything, and I said I wouldn't. And then I stayed up until 2 in the morning reading the comments and hating myself for it. The internet's version of the story was louder and faster and cruder than the real one. It had already sharpened itself into a narrative, a symbol, a content unit with tags and a thumbnail, and 100,000 people's opinions grafted onto a 30-second clip. Walsh, pressed against the brick wall. My mother, stepping out of the SUV. Walsh's face. It had a sound to it when I finally watched it. A sound the moment hadn't had when I was inside it. In real life, standing on that sidewalk, the loudest thing had been my own pulse. Internal Affairs opened a formal investigation within 72 hours. I know this because my mother told me, and because she never told me things she wasn't certain of. Walsh was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. His partner was reassigned. The precinct commander gave a statement that managed to express concern while committing to nothing, which my mother described, over dinner, as structurally identical to every statement they've given since 2003, and then she poured her tea and said, "Eat, Marcus." And I ate. 4 months later, Walsh's employment was terminated following the investigation's findings, which included the body camera footage he had claimed had failed to activate. Footage that was recovered by the department's technical unit and showed, with very little ambiguity, what had happened and what he had said against the brick wall. The woman across the street agreed to testify. Deshawn agreed to testify. I testified. My mother sat in the third row of a city oversight hearing room in January, in a different coat this time, grey with no silver button, serious and plain. And she listened to the findings read aloud, and her face was the same face she always wore in rooms where things needed to be handled. After, in the hallway, a journalist asked her how she felt. She looked at the journalist for a moment. Then she said, "I feel like we should not have had to be here." She walked to the elevator and pressed the button and waited with her hands in her pockets. We drove home together that evening. She took the long way without explaining why, and I didn't ask, because sometimes she needed the extra 20 minutes of city lights moving past the window before she could come back fully into the kitchen, and the dinner, and the next morning's early call. I watched the streetlights crossing her face in even intervals. She had aged in ways I couldn't precisely locate but absolutely felt in the months between October and January. Not more tired exactly, more crystallized, like pressure had not broken something in her but hardened it. I thought about the red front door, the October morning with the paint and the dropped brush and the drip on my sneaker. Now you're part of the house too, baby. Mom, I said. Thank you. She was quiet for a long moment. The city moved past the windows. Then, "You don't thank people for showing up, Marcus. You just show up." I looked out at the street. The night was cold and clear, one of those city nights where the sky almost convinces you it has depth, where you can almost believe, if you need to, that it goes all the way back. I thought about the calculus textbook falling open on the sidewalk, the pages turning in the wind, the neatness of all those numbers, still adding up to something correct, even while the world around them was not. I thought about what she'd said. "You don't thank people for showing up. You just show up." I understood, sitting in that car, that she had been teaching me this my entire life, not in speeches, not in warnings delivered at a kitchen table, or not only there, in the way she held the phone that morning, in the way she crossed those 8 steps of sidewalk, in the navy coat, and the low heels, and the single silver button, and the voice that was quiet instead of soft, that held instead of broke, that said, "Remove your hand from my son's neck," as though the alternative had simply never been factored in. The front door was still red. I could see it from half a block away, the same specific red she'd mixed herself from 2 cans in the hardware store on Archer, and it looked exactly the same as it always had, bright and declarative and unapologetic, visible from a distance in every kind of weather, in every season, in every year of my life that I had walked toward it and known, without having to think about it, that I was home. I was 17 years old. I had been pressed against a brick wall on a Tuesday morning for carrying a backpack, and I had watched one woman in 8 measured steps on a Claremont sidewalk make it impossible for a man to pretend that was acceptable, not with anger, not with volume, with the specific, unassailable weight of someone who had been preparing for that moment for 22 years, and was, when it came, entirely ready. I didn't need to thank her for that. I just needed to remember it, and carry it. And someday, on some sidewalk, in some October, in whatever city I happened to be standing in, show up.